I'm Bonnie Erbet. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and trends from diverse perspectives. Today, our woman thought leader is a force of nature, or as some would call her, a firebrand. She has been making her voice heard in Washington since 2006 in the House of Representatives and 2013 in the US Senate. She's the junior senator from Hawaii, Mazie Hirono. Thank you for joining us today, Senator Hirono, and welcome.
Thank you. Aloha, Bonnie. It's good to be with you.
Aloha too. What a state to be from, huh?
Yes, I feel very grateful.
Incredibly gorgeous in terms of geography and, oh my God, unbelievable vistas, but very far away from Washington, D.C., which you have to travel back and forth all the time. You have a new book out called Heart of Fire,
Yes.
An Immigrant Story.
Yes.
Now, first of all, why did you write it now and why did you call it that?
Heart of Fire very much refers to my mother's courage and bringing her children to this country so we can have a better life. So I wrote this book because my mother had suffered 2 strokes and I wanted to tell her story, which is really amazing. It is an homage to my mom, who I lost this year.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you, but she just created a life for me.
Right, exactly. It sounds like an amazing life for her children. Tell me about what about her turned you into a firebrand, particularly on the issue of healthcare. You were in the Senate in 2017 when Obama was out of the White House and Donald Trump was in it trying to get rid of healthcare along with other Republicans. What were you thinking? What about your mother made you hang in there?
Well, of course, my mom, when she brought us to this country, we had nothing, and she worked very low-paying jobs, which had absolutely no benefits, including healthcare. And so my greatest fear growing up as a child in this country was that my mom would get sick, and if she got sick, she wouldn't be able to go to work, no pay, no food. It was very basic. And so I knew how vulnerable we were to any kind of major illness. Sitting in the Senate, and even before then, because I was in the US House when we passed the Affordable Care Act, which enabled millions of people who up to that point had absolutely no health care to get health care. And here the Republicans tried dozens of times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. In 2017, little did I know that I would be confronted with a major health diagnosis myself. And once again was reminded how important healthcare coverage is for millions of people. And so when I got my diagnosis of stage 4 kidney cancer, again, it really brought home to me how vulnerable millions of Americans would be if they did not have the Affordable Care Act to rely on. And so you can bet that I was fighting against the repeal tooth and nail all the time. And one of the speeches that I gave on the floor of the Senate was really meaningful to me because I also, for the first time, talked about my sister who died in Japan, in my view, for lack of adequate health care.
How did that happen in Japan? I thought they had a good healthcare system.
Not in the country area that I lived in. I'm one of the few senators that was not born in a hospital. So all of my mother's children were born at home. I lived in a part of Japan that was very rural, very country. And so my baby sister contracted pneumonia and she was not hospitalized. And I remember she passed away. And I do think that if she had had access to healthcare, then perhaps she could have survived. So that was just one example. And then, of course, growing up, not having any healthcare coverage at all. And then myself being diagnosed with kidney cancer and having major operations and the cost of those operations. This is why, Bonnie, before the Affordable Care Act was passed, a huge percentage of the personal bankruptcies were as a result of unexpected, massive healthcare costs that were confronting people. And even and if you didn't have health care and your healthcare costs, it's by the thousands. And to get an operation, people literally couldn't afford it and they declared bankruptcy. And after the Affordable Care Act passed, millions of more people were able to get healthcare coverage. And literally, I would say Affordable Care Act saved lives.
So you're saying that that even bankruptcy is related to healthcare costs, that businesses are more likely to go bankrupt, I guess, that's what you're saying?
No, I'm saying individuals who face healthcare costs, because if you were facing thousands and thousands of dollars in unexpected healthcare bills because you didn't have any coverage, insurance coverage, you would declare bankruptcy. A lot of people did. These are individuals who did not have healthcare. And that's what the Affordable Care Act did. It provided millions of people without healthcare.
And is that what got you into being a real socially active advocate for healthcare, for
No.
Obamacare?
I knew how important healthcare was because as I said, when we first came to this country, we had no healthcare. I was really scared that mom would get sick. We would have no healthcare coverage. So from the very beginning, it was really important that people get healthcare. And I come from a state where we have something called prepaid healthcare. We have probably the best healthcare coverage of any state. So I was very aware that the people of Hawaii could rely on their employers, regardless of how many employees there were, to provide healthcare coverage. That is what the state law provided. That was not the case in the rest of the country. But Bonnie, I became an advocate for people who literally are getting screwed. I say that in public. I say that to the press. In our country, people are screwed every second, minute, hour of the day because they may not have healthcare, they may not have employment protections, all of that. And I lived that kind of life growing up as an immigrant. And so I was very intent on being in a position. It turned out that it was an elected office where I could fight for people who were getting screwed in our country. And I'm really grateful that I get to do that.
Now, tell me about your Asian American heritage. How has that helped make you are who you are? And tell me about how, if at all, you've been affected by the wave of Asian hate and violence that we've seen.
Asians for however long I can remember have been always viewed as the other, the perpetual foreigner. And this is why we have laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, that the Asian Americans are the perpetual outsiders to be discriminated against. And it's not just Asians, it's the Muslims and others, Jews, minority peoples have been discriminated in our country. And frankly, racism is never far below the surface in our country. And so we must be ever vigilant when racism rears its ugly head, which it does on a sadly pretty regular basis in our country. And of course, during the pandemic, you had a huge increase in hate crimes against Asian American Pacific Islanders. And we all saw the videos of Asians getting beaten up in public and bystanders not doing anything to help. And that is one of the major reasons that I really pushed for the COVID-19 hate crimes bill, which was finally voted on in a bipartisan way, and only one Republican voted against it. And that was to create an environment where Asians who were experiencing these kinds of terrible discrimination and hate crimes could report it, to have the Department of Justice get involved and engaged, and to work with the local law enforcement agencies as well as local advocacy groups to support the reporting and literally the prosecution of these kinds of hate crimes that really took a spike during the pandemic. As we all know, we had a president who called the pandemic the China virus, China flu. We had members of his administration calling it the Kung flu and all of that. That all led to the kind of, in my view, racist crimes targeting Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
So you blame Trump? You think there's a direct connection between what he said in public and these, was it a spurt of violence that happened? Or does it happen all the time and it just doesn't get media coverage?
I think when I said that racism is never far below the surface, let's face it, Bonnie, our country has never really dealt with the racism against Blacks, slavery. And that is a history of our country. We have not dealt with what happened, what our country did to the American Indians and to the Native Hawaiians. And so racism is never far below the surface, and we need to be ever watchful when it rears its ugly head. So Asians have always been seen as the other and outsiders, perpetual foreigners, and this is why discriminatory laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, where Chinese were excluded from even coming into our country at one point. And the terrible decision to incarcerate 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, just because they were Japanese Americans. So the history of our country in these cases is really terrible. And so when it raises its head, and including, I have to include, during the pandemic, there were also discrimination, terrible discrimination against Jews. And when Trump first got elected, he had the Muslim ban. So I'm not blaming Trump. What he did was tap into the kind of racial animus that exists in our country.
As an American Jew, cultural Jew, I follow that more closely, but that's been going on for a long time.
Yes.
There have been, things written on subway walls, and
Yes.
even on the wall of a professor at Columbia University, my alma mater. So that kind of stuff has been happening even before Trump. But as you say,
oh yes,
right.
Sadly, yes.
Anyway, is healthcare the most important issue to you?
It's very fundamental that people should have healthcare. I consider healthcare a right, not a privilege. I also think that voting is a right, not a privilege. And you probably know, Bonnie, that there are hundreds and hundreds of bills being considered in state legislatures all across the country to basically steal our votes. Voter suppression is alive and well in our country, and it's blatant. And this is why Congress should enact voter protection legislation.
Do the Democrats have as hard a time getting Asian Americans out to vote as they do Hispanic Americans and Black Americans and young people of all colors?
With the voter suppression going on, all of the groups that you mentioned are going to have a much harder time voting, exercising their vote, because the hours of voting is being limited. The places where they can vote is being limited. There are additional requirements before they can vote. So all of these groups are targets. Why? Because the Republicans have decided that these are groups that tend to vote Democratic, and they're going to do everything they can to make it much tougher to vote. In fact, Georgia's law makes it a crime to even provide food and water to people who are waiting in line to vote. We all saw those long lines in Georgia and other places. So they have now enacted a law that makes it illegal for good-hearted people to provide them food and water as they are waiting in line. So that's just one of the kinds of laws that Georgia has enacted, and the kind of laws that are being passed all across the country to suppress votes, basically to steal the votes of young people, minority people, Blacks, Hispanics, Asian Americans.
Well, and on top of that, there was recently an article in the New York Times about how Republicans have set it up for themselves to control all the Secretary of State offices in the key states, which are, purple, not blue, not red. How is that moving forward going to impact voting for everybody?
The most important thing we can do is to pass voter protection laws, such as the John Lewis voter protection law, which will enable the Department of Justice to basically prevent these kinds of voter suppression laws from being enacted in the first place. But because the Supreme Court, in a very important case, eliminated that kind of protection, the states are very busy enacting hundreds, literally dozens, voter suppression laws and considering hundreds of other voter suppression laws to pass. So one of the really nefarious things that being passed is, for example, in Georgia, any voter can challenge any other voter. So if I were a Georgia voter, I can challenge another voter for fraud. And then it is up to the person being challenged to prevent that, to show that they haven't committed any kind of voter fraud. That is how bad it is. And there are also groups that are already signing up volunteers to challenge other voters any number of times. And then you talked about controlling the state elections. Well, the Georgia law also enables the state legislature, controlled by Republicans, to control their election board by controlling 3 of the 5 seats. So these are just blatant, they're not even attempts. These are blatant laws that make it much, much tougher to vote in these states.
Do you see a future where it's going to be much harder for statewide candidates or even district candidates for the House to get elected because of the predominance of Republican secretaries of state, many of whom are Trump affiliates?
They're trying to control who the secretaries of states are, and if they run for office, it's going to be their candidates. So the Republicans have been planning for this kind of takeover for decades. They also can rely on a lot of dark money to help them achieve these ends. That's why campaign spending reform also needs to happen. The disclosure of all these contributors of dark money should also happen, but the Republicans have absolutely no incentive and no interest to help us enact any of these kinds of reform measures.
Do you think Donald Trump is going to run again?
He says so. But whatever the case, the damage is already being done all across our country with these vote stealing laws. And so all of these people who want to be Trump Juniors or mini Trumps, they're very busy getting themselves on the ballots.
What do you think about an independent, actually Republican like Lynn Cheney running against him to give moderate Republicans who still exist in the populace, even if they don't exist much in the House or Senate, to run against Trump and drain off enough votes to win the election, for the Democrats to win the election?
I would love for a sane person to challenge Donald Trump if in fact he runs. But I do know that the Republican Party, you can't even call it a Republican Party. It's a Trump party. It's a Trump of insurrection, rioters. And when you look at the Texas law, for example, bounty hunters, that's what the Republican Party is.
Are Democrats going to turn around and try to use, if the Supreme Court approves the Texas law, anti-abortion law, which of course allows citizens to make complaints, not government officials, against clinics or doctors or what have you, who are providing abortion. Are the Democrats going to try to use that, say, to any victim of gun violence can sue the person who shot them and the gun manufacturer, for example? Are there any plans to use that same kind of power?
I would think that the Democratic controlled state legislatures would contemplate such a thing. And why not? If Texas thinks that it can get away with basically going against the constitutional Roe v. Wade decision, and if any state can get around a Supreme Court dictate like that, law protection, then why not for every other issue such as you mentioned? And that is why the Supreme Court and not stepping up and saying that we are going to prevent Texas from implementing this law until we the Supreme Court decides whether or not to overturn Roe v. Wade, is what the Supreme Court should have done, but not this Supreme Court. Donald Trump said that he was going to nominate to the Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And he has 3 justices on the Supreme Court.
But there's also a lot of talk. I covered the court from in the late 80s and through the early mid 90s. And they always, the talk among journalists back then was that the Rehnquist court would not, even if it had the votes, would not overturn Roe because there are so many holes in Roe as it stands. It's not the same law that the Supreme Court approved in the early 70s. And so why give liberal Democrats the impetus to start big marches and a whole social movement against Republicans and lose women's votes forever, or the vast majority of women's votes, and just do something that looks on paper similar to overturning Roe, but not quite overturning Roe. So Democrats could not use that issue against Republicans. Do you think they may do that?
They may, but if the effect of whatever the Supreme Court does that vastly limits a woman's right to an abortion, a woman's right to exercise control over her own body, I'd say that we should see through that kind of a ploy on the part of the Supreme Court, and the women in this country will continue to march and continue to stand up for their right to choose and have control over their own body. That is my hope. Women are becoming mobilized all across the country in response and reaction to what Texas has done. And by the way, what many other states are doing to totally restrict a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to abortion.
What message, what takeaway do you want people to have after they read your book?
I hope that they can find, especially women, can find something that they can relate to. I know very few women who have not been told at some point in their lives that you can't do this, you are not good enough, you don't have enough experience, all of that. I don't know a single woman who has not been told those things. And so I hope women will say, that's right, and get those voices out of our heads and chart our own course. Another thing that I hope people can relate to is that all of us at some point have faced major health issues, and that I hope women can relate to the fact that, we need to support healthcare as a right, not a privilege. I hope that people will begin to, especially women, will use their voices to stand up for ourselves, because it's been quite the journey for me to become the outspoken advocate that I am, to stand up against bullies like Trump. We should take risks, get out of our comfort zone, use our voices, speak up for the things that we care about. So, for example, if you've never gotten involved in some cause, then do it. Or if you've never marched for anything, do it. Just get out of our comfort zone. If you've never spoken up against a bully, do it.
As a member of the U.S. Senate, and prior to that, a House member, did you ever face discrimination by someone who, a staff member, a senator, what have you, somebody who didn't probably recognize who you were?
As I said, all through my political time, as I've gone through my experiences, I know that there were so many times when usually men, unasked for, would come and tell me that I wasn't ready for this race, or that I would not be able to win, and that they would not help me. So those are common experiences that women have, not just those of us who run for office, but anybody who in business, any walk of life, I'd say women have had those kind of experiences. So yes, all of us, I think, have experienced discrimination of that sort. I describe that as discrimination. People respond to us in those kinds of ways, and women we have to use our voices and stand up for ourselves.
It's amazing.
It's good when we do it together.
It's amazing that they would come to you without you having asked their opinion.
This was earlier on in my political life, where the men thought they could give me advice like that, unasked for. But as I said, it took me a while to get those voices out of my head and to listen to my own voices.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Senator
Thank you,
Mazie
Bonnie.
Hirono, the junior senator from Hawaii, a Democrat, and author of the book Hearts of Fire, an Immigrant Story. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please continue the conversation with us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, or our PBS website, tothecontrary.org. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.